The hum of the engines provided a steady backdrop to the rhythm of morning travel at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. The sun had risen hours ago, bathing the terminal in soft golden light that reflected off the polished floors. Travelers moved with a mix of urgency and routine, their suitcases trailing behind them like whispers in the air. Among the crowd, Alicia Monroe stood with a quiet poise, her tailored navy blazer a subtle declaration of her place in the professional world. Her natural curls framed a face that radiated calm determination, though her eyes carried the weight of unspoken thoughts. She gripped a leather briefcase in one hand and her boarding pass in the other. Her brother, Marcus, walked beside her, his casual demeanor a comforting counterbalance to her focused energy. Dressed in a crisp button-down and dark jeans, Marcus had always been her steadying force, a reminder that no matter how turbulent life became, she was never entirely alone. As the announcement for Flight 482 echoed through the terminal, Marcus glanced at the board. Gate B12, 10 minutes. You sure you don't want a coffee before we board? Alicia shook her head, offering him a small smile. No, thanks. I'd rather not risk needing the restroom mid-flight. He chuckled and gestured toward the kiosk. Suit yourself. I'll be back. She watched him go before making her way to the gate alone. The air carried a faint metallic tang, mingling with the distant hum of voices and the soft roll of wheels on tile. When she handed her boarding pass to the agent, the young woman smiled warmly. Welcome aboard, Ms. Monroe. Seat 2A, first class. Alicia nodded, her thank you polite but reserved. She had learned early on that blending into spaces like this required precision. Not too much warmth lest it be mistaken for submission, but never cold, as that would invite its own assumptions. It was a delicate balance, one she had mastered over years of navigating boardrooms, airports, and auditoriums where she was often the only face that looked like hers. Inside the plane, the first-class cabin exuded understated luxury. Wide leather seats offered ample legroom, and the muted colors of the upholstery seemed designed to soothe weary travelers. Alicia placed her briefcase in the overhead bin and settled into her window seat. She pulled out her tablet, intending to review the presentation for her upcoming meeting. The quiet focus of the cabin usually allowed her to disappear into her work, but today felt different. It started subtly, a lingering glance from one of the flight attendants as Alicia fastened her seatbelt. Cheryl Alden moved through the aisle with practiced efficiency, her uniform crisp and her steps deliberate. But when her gaze landed on Alicia, it faltered, tightening into something unreadable before she moved on. Alicia noticed the shift but dismissed it, chalking it up to the peculiarities of human behavior. She had learned not to look too closely at such moments. Doing so rarely served her peace of mind. A few minutes later, Marcus passed by her seat on his way to the economy cabin. He carried a steaming cup of coffee and grinned at her. Don't fall asleep on me up here, he teased. I'll try not to, she replied lightly, a flicker of humor breaking through her otherwise composed demeanor. As the plane filled with passengers, Alicia returned to her tablet. Though her focus wavered, she glanced occasionally at the activity around her, the overhead bins closing, the murmured exchanges of fellow travelers. Across the aisle, a man in a tailored suit adjusted his tie, his salt and pepper hair suggesting a life of polished professionalism. He caught Alicia's eye briefly, offering a polite nod, which she returned. It was a small gesture, yet it carried an unspoken acknowledgement of shared space, if nothing else. But not every glance felt so benign. Cheryl reappeared moments later, her presence sharper this time, as if she had resolved something in her mind. She stopped beside Alicia's seat, her tone polite but clipped. Good morning, ma'am. May I see your boarding pass? The request, though framed in courtesy, carried an edge that Alicia couldn't ignore. She met Cheryl's gaze evenly, a quiet firmness in her response. Of course. She handed over the pass. Cheryl scrutinized the ticket longer than seemed necessary, her brow furrowing almost imperceptibly. This is for first class? She asked, her tone laced with disbelief. Yes, Alicia said, her voice calm. Is there a problem? Cheryl hesitated, then shook her head. No problem, just verifying. She handed the pass back and moved on. But the tension lingered. Alicia returned to her tablet. Her outward composure intact, though a faint unease crept into her thoughts. She had faced moments like this before, small, insidious tests of her legitimacy in spaces she had every right to occupy. They were seldom overt, but their weight was undeniable. A reminder that acceptance was never guaranteed. Behind her, Marcus settled into his seat in the economy cabin. Oblivious to the exchange, his easygoing nature made him a magnet for friendly conversation. And he was soon chatting with the passenger beside him. But Alicia sat alone with her thoughts. The calm of the cabin now tinged with an undercurrent of discomfort. The plane began to taxi, the engines roaring to life as it prepared for takeoff. Alicia leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes briefly as the familiar rhythm of flight enveloped her. Yet the moment of calm was fleeting. Cheryl's voice came over the intercom, crisp and authoritative as she delivered the safety briefing. Alicia opened her eyes, catching a brief glance from the flight attendant as she moved through the aisles. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Alicia felt it, the weight of assumptions, of unspoken questions that she had long learned to navigate. This wasn't new, and yet it never felt old. As the plane lifted into the sky, the earth falling away beneath it, Alicia couldn't shake the feeling that this flight would be different, that what had started as a routine journey would soon become anything but. The plane climbed steadily, its engines humming against the backdrop of clear blue skies. Alicia gazed out the window, the expanse of clouds below reminding her of the calm she always sought during travel. She shifted in her seat, pulling her tablet back onto her lap. The meeting slides stared back at her, but the earlier interaction with the flight attendant lingered like a faint echo. She had learned to compartmentalize moments like this, to keep them in a place where they wouldn't disrupt her focus. Yet, this one felt heavier, harder to dismiss. Cheryl Alden moved through the first-class cabin with deliberate efficiency. Her polished demeanor and crisp uniform spoke of years of experience. Yet, today, her steps carried a subtle tension, her movements just shy of seamless. Each time she passed Alicia's row, her eyes lingered, though she quickly averted them when Alicia glanced up. The cabin was quiet, the soft murmur of passengers settling in blending with the hum of the engines. It was the kind of stillness that magnified even the smallest dissonance. When Cheryl approached again, Alicia looked up, mildly surprised by her return. "Miss Monroe," Cheryl began, her tone polite but firm. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" Alicia's brows furrowed slightly as she set her tablet aside. "Of course," she said, her voice calm but edged with curiosity. Cheryl gestured toward the galley, away from the rows of seats. "If you don't mind stepping over here." The request drew quiet glances from other passengers. Alicia stood gracefully, her movements unhurried, and followed Cheryl past the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the cabin. The murmurs of passengers behind her were barely audible, yet their presence was unmistakable, a subtle chorus of curiosity and speculation. In the confined space of the galley, Cheryl turned to face Alicia. Her expression was composed, yet a flicker of uncertainty lingered in her eyes. "Miss Monroe," she began, "it seems there may have been an issue with your seat assignment. I'll need you to relocate to the main cabin." Alicia blinked, her confusion momentary but unmistakable. "An issue?" she asked evenly. "My ticket was booked and confirmed weeks ago. I don't understand how there could be a mistake." Cheryl's tone hardened just slightly, enough to mark the shift from professional to authoritative. "I've double-checked the manifest. It appears this seat was assigned to another passenger." Alicia met Cheryl's gaze with quiet firmness. "That doesn't make sense. My boarding pass clearly states this seat. And your colleague confirmed it when I boarded. If there's been an error, I'd like to see the details." The quiet strength in Alicia's tone seemed to unsettle Cheryl. For a moment, the flight attendant hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing against her carefully constructed composure. "Miss Monroe," Cheryl said, her voice lower but no less insistent. "I'm asking you to cooperate so we can avoid further complications." Alicia took a steadying breath, her posture unwavering. "I am cooperating," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "But I have a right to understand why I'm being asked to move from a seat I paid for. If there's truly an issue, I'd like clarity." The tension between them was palpable. A silent clash of wills that neither seemed willing to relinquish. Before Cheryl could respond, the curtain behind them shifted slightly, and Marcus stepped through. His expression was calm but tinged with concern as his eyes moved between his sister and the flight attendant. "Is everything okay here?" he asked. His tone measured but firm. Cheryl's gaze darted to Marcus, her composure slipping for the briefest moment before she recovered. "Sir, this doesn't concern you. It does if it concerns my sister," Marcus replied, his voice even but unmistakably protective. Alicia placed a hand on her brother's arm, a subtle gesture of reassurance. "I'm handling it, Marcus," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. He hesitated, then gave a small nod before stepping back, though the tension in his posture remained. Cheryl exhaled sharply, her frustration evident despite her attempts to maintain control. "Miss Monroe," she began again, "I'm trying to prevent an escalation." "So am I," Alicia replied evenly, "but I also believe in addressing issues transparently. If there's a problem, let's resolve it. I've done everything by the book. Now I'd like the same courtesy." Their exchange was interrupted by Linda, another flight attendant, who stepped into the galley with a tray of service items. Her eyes flicked between Alicia and Cheryl, quickly assessing the scene. "Everything all right here?" Linda asked, her tone light but tinged with concern. Cheryl straightened, her expression tightening. "There's been a mix-up with Miss Monroe's seat. I'm handling it." Linda nodded, her gaze shifting to Alicia. "I just finished checking the manifest," she said. "Would you like me to verify it again? Just to be sure?" Cheryl hesitated, her pride warring with practicality. After a moment, she gave a curt nod. "Fine, make it quick." Linda moved to a nearby console, her fingers deftly navigating the passenger data. Alicia stood in quiet composure, her expression calm but watchful. Cheryl, on the other hand, stood rigidly, her gaze fixed on the floor as if avoiding the weight of the moment. After a few moments, Linda looked up, her voice steady. "There's no error," she said. "Miss Monroe's seat assignment is correct." Alicia exhaled quietly, a mix of relief and vindication passing through her. "Thank you," she said, her tone gracious but firm. "I appreciate your help." Linda offered a small smile, her demeanor soothing. "Of course, Miss Monroe, please return to your seat." As Alicia walked back to her row, the cabin seemed to hum with subdued energy. Passengers exchanged glances, their curiosity heightened by the interaction they had partially witnessed. Cheryl remained in the galley, her jaw tight and her thoughts racing. Back in her seat, Alicia picked up her tablet. Though her focus was fractured, her outward calm belied the turmoil within, a quiet reckoning with the reality of what had just transpired. She glanced toward the window, the clouds rolling by in a tranquil procession. But tranquility was not what she felt. In the economy cabin, Marcus stared at his phone, his thumb hovering over Alicia's number. He debated sending another message, though he knew her response would likely be the same, a quiet assurance that she was fine. Even when he knew she wasn't. The plane cruised steadily at 30,000 feet. But the undercurrent of tension was unrelenting. It was the kind of unease that settled deep. A reminder that battles against bias were seldom loud or dramatic. They were quiet, persistent, and, perhaps, all the more insidious because of it. The plane settled into its cruising altitude, the steady hum of the engines blending with the quiet murmurs of passengers adjusting to the long flight ahead. Alicia sat still in her first-class seat, her tablet resting on her lap. But the words on the screen blurred into unreadable shapes. Her mind returned to the confrontation in the galley, a subtle yet significant moment that lingered in her thoughts. It was not the first time she had faced scrutiny in spaces where she belonged but was seen as out of place. It would not be the last. Outside the window, the sky stretched vast and unbroken, a serene contrast to the quiet tension in the cabin. Alicia leaned back, her gaze fixed on the endless expanse of clouds, searching for the calm that usually came with flying. But today, that calm eluded her. In the galley, Cheryl Alden stood with her arms folded, her posture rigid. She stared blankly at the service tray in front of her, her thoughts far from the routine tasks of the flight. The words of her colleague, Linda, replayed in her mind. "There's no error." Miss Monroe's seat assignment is correct. It was a simple statement, delivered matter-of-factly, yet it unraveled something in Cheryl. She prided herself on being efficient, professional, and perceptive, traits that had carried her through years of working in an industry that demanded composure under pressure. But today, those traits felt hollow, their edges dulled by the nagging discomfort she couldn't ignore. Linda entered the galley, her presence quiet but grounding. She glanced at Cheryl, her brow furrowing slightly. "You seem distracted," she said softly, her tone neutral but probing. Cheryl straightened, her voice clipped. "I'm fine, just focusing on the service." Linda didn't press, though her gaze lingered on Cheryl for a moment longer. She was used to reading people, a skill honed from years of dealing with passengers and crew. Something about Cheryl's demeanor told her this wasn't just a bad day, it was a reckoning. Subtle but significant. In the economy cabin, Marcus sat with his arms crossed, his foot tapping lightly against the floor. He had tried to lose himself in the in-flight magazine, flipping through pages of travel tips and glossy photos of distant destinations. But his thoughts kept returning to Alicia. The moment he had witnessed in the galley felt unresolved, its weight pressing on him like a quiet storm. The passenger beside him, an older man with a warm but weathered face, broke the silence. "Was that your sister earlier?" he asked, his voice low. Marcus nodded. "Yeah." The man shook his head, his expression thoughtful. "Saw her boarding. Looked like she belonged there more than half the people in first class. Don't understand why anyone would question it." Marcus offered a tight smile, though his jaw remained clenched. "It's not about understanding. It's about assumptions." The man nodded again, a knowing look in his eyes. "Yeah, it always is." Back in first class, Alicia caught fragments of whispered conversations from other passengers. Their voices were low, their words indistinct, but the glances they cast in her direction spoke volumes. She knew this script too well, the quiet scrutiny, the unspoken questions, the subtle distancing. It was never overt, but it was always present. Across the aisle, a man in a tailored suit watched her for a moment before leaning slightly toward her. "Excuse me," he said softly, "I couldn't help but notice what happened earlier. Is everything all right?" Alicia turned to him, her expression measured. "Thank you for asking," she said evenly. "It was just a misunderstanding. It's been resolved." The man frowned slightly. "Didn't look like a misunderstanding. Looked like someone overstepped." Alicia hesitated, weighing her response. She had no desire to prolong the conversation. Yet the man's concern seemed genuine. "I appreciate your concern," she said finally, "but it's being handled." The man nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask," he said, his voice kind but firm. "People like that need to be reminded they can't treat others however they please." Alicia gave him a polite smile, grateful for his support but unwilling to dwell on the incident. She returned her attention to her tablet, though the slides of her presentation seemed impossibly distant from the reality she was navigating. Cheryl reappeared in the first-class cabin, her tray balanced expertly in her hands. Her movements were precise, her professionalism intact, but her mind was elsewhere. She avoided Alicia's gaze, her earlier certainty now replaced by something more tentative. When she placed a glass of sparkling water on Alicia's tray table, her hand lingered for just a moment too long before she pulled away. "Is there anything else I can get for you, Miss Monroe?" Cheryl asked, her voice carefully neutral. Alicia looked up, her expression calm but unreadable. "No, thank you," she replied evenly. "I'm fine." Cheryl nodded and moved on, her posture stiff. The exchange was brief, almost inconsequential, yet it carried the weight of something larger, an unspoken acknowledgement of the tension that neither could fully articulate. In the galley, Linda watched Cheryl with quiet concern. She approached her colleague cautiously, her voice low. "You've been off today," she said. "What's going on?" Cheryl sighed, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "I thought," she trailed off, shaking her head. "I don't know what I thought. But I handled it poorly." Linda nodded slowly, her tone gentle but firm. "It's not too late to make it right." Cheryl stiffened at the suggestion. Apologizing wasn't something she did easily. It felt like admitting defeat. And she wasn't sure she was ready for that. I'll think about it, she said quietly, avoiding Linda's gaze. As the flight continued, the cabin settled into a tentative calm. Passengers flipped through magazines, scrolled on their devices, and engaged in hushed conversations. But beneath the surface, an undercurrent of tension lingered, a quiet reminder of the unresolved dynamics that had taken root. For Alicia, the flight was far from over. She knew the journey ahead was about more than reaching her destination. It was about navigating the unspoken boundaries of a world that often demanded she prove her place in it. Even when she had every right to be there. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, steady but firm, breaking the quiet hum of the flight. Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a minor systems issue. As a precaution, we'll be making an unscheduled landing at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. Please remain seated and follow the instructions of the cabin crew. The announcement sent a ripple through the cabin, a murmur of voices rising as passengers exchanged nervous glances. Alicia straightened in her seat, her gaze shifting from her tablet to the window, where the horizon stretched in a blur of soft clouds and distant blue. This was not how she'd planned her journey. But then again, much of the day had unfolded in ways she hadn't expected. In the economy cabin, Marcus sat up abruptly, his shoulders tense as he processed the announcement. He glanced toward the front of the plane, his worry for Alicia mingling with a general unease about the sudden change in plans. Around him, passengers whispered in tones too low to discern, their collective tension adding to the charged atmosphere. Cheryl Alden, standing in the galley, adjusted the drink cart with hands that trembled slightly. The day's events had already unsettled her, and now the unexpected landing felt like yet another disruption. She exhaled slowly, willing herself to focus. Passengers needed reassurance, not a flight attendant who appeared rattled. Linda, ever composed, moved through the aisles, her voice calm as she addressed a concerned couple. This is just a precautionary measure, she explained, her tone soothing. The captain assures us there's nothing to worry about. Cheryl watched her colleague with a mixture of admiration and envy. Linda always seemed to handle these moments with grace, while Cheryl felt her own composure slipping. She couldn't shake the lingering discomfort from her earlier interactions with Alicia. The weight of her choices pressed against her, even as she tried to push it aside. Back in her seat, Alicia's phone buzzed softly. She glanced down to find a text from Marcus. "Everything okay up there? Let me know if you need me." She typed a quick reply. "I'm fine. Don't worry." But the truth was more complicated. The unscheduled landing felt like a metaphor for the day's events, unplanned, unsettling, and rife with uncertainty. She glanced around the cabin, noting the subtle shifts in body language, the quiet murmurs of passengers who suddenly felt unmoored, even in the calmest moments. It didn't take much for the equilibrium of a shared space to fracture. As the plane began its descent, Cheryl moved through the first-class cabin with renewed determination. She offered Alicia a glass of water, her movements careful, her tone clipped but polite. "Is there anything else I can get for you, Miss Monroe?" Alicia looked up, her expression neutral. "No, thank you," she said, her voice steady. Cheryl nodded and moved on. But the interaction lingered. Alicia could sense the flight attendant's discomfort, the quiet unease that had replaced the earlier rigidity. It was a subtle shift. But Alicia noticed. She always noticed. The plane touched down smoothly, the tires kissing the runway with barely a jolt. Passengers exhaled collectively, the release of tension almost audible. The captain's voice returned, thanking everyone for their cooperation and assuring them that the issue was being resolved. But the relief was tempered by the knowledge that their plans had been interrupted, their journeys delayed. As the plane taxied to the gate, Marcus stood, his stride purposeful as he made his way to the front of the cabin. Cheryl noticed him immediately, her posture stiffening as he approached Alicia's row. Before she could intercept him, he was already speaking. "Everything okay?" Marcus asked, his voice low but firm as he addressed his sister. "I'm fine," Alicia replied, though her tone lacked conviction. She met his gaze, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Marcus turned to Cheryl, his expression unreadable. "Is there a problem here?" Cheryl hesitated, her professional mask slipping for a fraction of a second. "No, sir," she said, her voice measured. Your sister's seat is confirmed. There's no issue. Good, Marcus said, his tone carrying just enough weight to make his presence felt. He glanced back at Alicia, who gave him a subtle nod of reassurance that she could handle the situation. Reluctantly, he returned to the economy cabin, though the tension in his shoulders remained. Inside the terminal, the humid Texas air mingled with the sterile chill of air conditioning as passengers disembarked. Alicia walked beside Marcus, her movements measured, her expression composed. The earlier encounter had left a mark, but she had no intention of letting it define her. At the gate, Cheryl stood by the cabin door, her smile strained as she thanked passengers. When Alicia passed, their eyes met briefly. It was a fleeting moment, but one heavy with unspoken meaning. For Cheryl, it was a moment of reckoning, a quiet acknowledgement of her misstep. For Alicia, it was a reminder of the work still to be done, not just on this flight but in countless spaces where assumptions and biases created barriers. Once inside the terminal, Marcus guided Alicia to a quiet seating area. Sit, he urged gently. I'll figure out the next steps. Alicia didn't protest. She lowered herself into the plastic chair, pulling out her phone to distract herself with emails and headlines. But her mind drifted back to the flight, to the questions Cheryl had raised, not just about her seat, but about the broader assumptions that had fueled the interaction. Nearby, Marcus approached the airline's customer service desk. The line was long, passengers growing restless as the lone representative struggled to field their complaints. When it was finally his turn, Marcus leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. My sister and I were on the flight that just landed, he said. We were traveling in first class. And there were complications. I'd like to speak to someone higher up. The representative blinked, startled by his tone. Let me check with my supervisor, she replied, picking up the phone. Back in the seating area, Alicia's phone buzzed with a message from her friend Justine. Call me when you're free. Hope you're okay. Alicia smiled faintly, grateful for Justine's support. She tucked her phone into her bag and leaned back, letting the hum of the terminal wash over her. The day wasn't over, and the challenges it had brought were far from resolved. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of stillness. A quiet pause before the next steps in a journey she hadn't chosen but was determined to navigate. The terminal buzzed with the low hum of travelers navigating the unexpected delay. Alicia and Marcus found themselves in a quiet corner of the seating area, removed from the cacophony of rolling luggage and frustrated murmurs. Alicia sat with her back straight, her hands folded neatly on her lap. She wore an expression of quiet composure, but Marcus could see the tension in her shoulders, the unspoken weight she carried. He set a cup of coffee on the table beside her. Drink this, he said gently. It's going to be a long evening. Alicia glanced at the cup and gave a faint smile. Thanks, she said, though her tone lacked conviction. Marcus sat across from her, his elbows resting on his knees. You've barely said a word since we landed. What's on your mind? She hesitated, her gaze drifting to the window where the planes outside moved in slow, deliberate patterns. I'm just tired, Marcus, she said finally. Not just from today, from everything. Marcus nodded slowly. He understood the layers beneath her words, the experiences she didn't need to articulate. What happened today? He said carefully. It wasn't just about a seat. No, it wasn't, Alicia agreed, her voice quiet but firm. It's never just about the seat. It's about what the seat represents. Belonging, legitimacy, the idea that you have to prove yourself in spaces where you've already earned the right to be. He leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. So, what's the plan? Are we letting this go? Or are we doing something about it? Alicia turned to him, her eyes steady. We're doing something about it, she said simply. The determination in her voice settled something in Marcus. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts. Justine's already reached out to you, hasn't she? Alicia nodded. She wants to strategize, figure out how to approach this without it becoming messy. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Messy? The whole thing's already messy. Cheryl practically accused you of being an imposter. Alicia held up a hand. And I corrected her. I didn't let her push me out of my seat. And I won't let her actions define this situation. But we have to be smart about how we address it. This isn't just about me. Marcus's phone buzzed, pulling his attention. He glanced at the screen and frowned. They're sending someone down, he said. Supervisor, I think. They want to discuss the matter. He said the last words with air quotes. His skepticism apparent. Alicia sighed and leaned back in her chair. Here we go. A few minutes later, a woman in a sharp navy suit approached. Her badge identified her as Angela Reyes, terminal manager. She carried herself with a practiced calm, her professional smile in place but her eyes scanning the siblings with quiet curiosity. Mr. and Ms. Monroe? She asked. Her tone polite. That's us, Marcus said, standing and offering his hand. Angela shook his hand, then turned to Alicia. Thank you for waiting. I understand you've had some concerns about your flight? Concerns, Alicia repeated, her tone even. That's one way to put it. Angela gestured toward a nearby conference room. Why don't we step inside? It'll be quieter, and we can discuss this more comfortably. The room was small and sterile, its beige walls adorned with generic airline posters. Angela took a seat across from them, pulling out a notepad. First, let me apologize for any inconvenience you experienced. Can you tell me what happened? Marcus glanced at Alicia, silently deferring to her. She nodded and began recounting the events of the flight, her voice calm but measured. She described Cheryl's actions, the request to move her seat, and the subsequent apology. She spoke without embellishment, letting the facts speak for themselves. Angela listened intently, her pen moving swiftly across the page. When Alicia finished, Angela looked up. I appreciate you sharing this with me. We take incidents like this very seriously. And I'll be escalating your concerns to our corporate office. Alicia studied Angela, weighing her words. I don't want an apology, Ms. Reyes, she said. I want accountability. I want to know what your airline is doing to address these kinds of situations so they don't happen again. Angela nodded. Understood. We've been working on diversity training for our staff. But it's clear we need to do more. I'll ensure this incident is part of that review. Marcus leaned forward, his voice firm. How will we know this isn't just swept under the rug? We've heard promises before. Angela's expression softened. You have my word. And if you'd like, I can provide my direct contact information so you can follow up with me personally. Marcus seemed satisfied for the moment, though his protective instincts remained on high alert. Alicia, too, felt a flicker of cautious optimism. The conversation was a step forward, but she knew words alone wouldn't resolve the deeper issues at play. As they left the room, Angela handed Alicia a business card. If you think of anything else, don't hesitate to reach out, she said. Thank you, Alicia replied, her tone polite but reserved. Back in the terminal, the siblings found another quiet spot to regroup. Marcus leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. Do you think they'll actually do anything? I don't know, Alicia admitted. But we've started the conversation. Now it's up to us to make sure it continues. She pulled out her phone and typed a quick message to Justine. Met with the terminal manager. Promises were made. Let's talk next steps. As she hit send, Alicia felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about one flight or one interaction. It was about challenging the assumptions and biases that permeated so many aspects of daily life. And for Alicia, that fight was far from over. The morning air in Dallas was thick with humidity, a subtle weight pressing against the glass walls of the hotel lobby. Alicia sat in a corner, her laptop open but untouched. Her hands rested on the table, fingers interlaced as she stared at the screen. Across from her, Marcus leaned back in his chair, scrolling on his phone with a quiet focus that belied his simmering frustration. Justine wants us to push this, Alicia said finally, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm, but her words carried the weight of her resolve. She's drafting a letter to the airline's leadership. She thinks we need to go public if they don't respond adequately. Marcus looked up, his brow furrowed. And what do you think? Alicia exhaled slowly, her gaze shifting to the street outside, where taxis came and went in an endless rhythm. I think she's right, but I don't want this to become about me. It's bigger than that. It is bigger than you. Marcus agreed, leaning forward. But you're the one who can shine a light on it. If we let this slide, it's just going to keep happening to you. To other people. Alicia nodded, though her expression remained thoughtful. I just want to make sure we're strategic. If we go public, it needs to be about the broader issue, not just this one incident. Marcus reached across the table and placed a hand over hers. Whatever you decide, I'm with you. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Justine's email. Alicia opened it, her eyes scanning the carefully crafted draft. The tone was measured, professional, but unflinching. It outlined the events of the flight, the implications of Cheryl's actions, and a clear call for systemic reform. Attached was a proposed timeline for the airline to respond, along with a note: if they fail to act, we'll release this to the press. Alicia felt a flicker of gratitude for Justine's precision. The letter didn't just demand accountability, it framed the incident as part of a larger pattern, one that could no longer be ignored. I'll send it today, Alicia said, her voice firm. Marcus nodded. Good. Let's see how they respond. Blank. Blank. Later that afternoon, the siblings met with Evelyn Hart. The journalist Justine had connected them with. Evelyn was older, with silver-streaked hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She carried a notepad and a recorder. Her demeanor professional but approachable. Thank you for meeting with me, Evelyn said, settling into her chair at the cafe. I want to make sure your story is handled with care. This isn't just about exposing what happened, it's about creating a larger conversation. Alicia appreciated Evelyn's thoughtful approach. She recounted the events of the flight with the same calm precision she had used in her earlier meeting with the airline's manager. Marcus added his perspective, emphasizing the broader implications of the incident and the patterns it revealed. What do you hope to achieve by sharing your story? Evelyn asked, her pen poised over the notepad. I want accountability, Alicia said firmly, not just from the airline, but from every organization that allows bias to go unchecked. This isn't about punishing one person, it's about creating a culture where people are treated with dignity and respect. Evelyn nodded, her expression thoughtful. I'll draft the piece and let you review it before it goes live. If the airline doesn't respond adequately, we'll be ready. Blank. The following day, Alicia received a reply from the airline's leadership team. The email was conciliatory, outlining their plan to address the incident, a formal apology, a review of training programs, and the implementation of mandatory bias training for all employees within 3 months. It was a start, but it felt more like damage control than a genuine commitment to change. Alicia forwarded the email to Justine, who called her within minutes. This is progress, Justine said, but it's not enough. We need them to make a public statement. Private assurances mean nothing if there's no accountability. I agree, Alicia said. Let's push for more. Blank. A few days later, Alicia and Marcus met with Dr. Julian Carter, the director of a prominent civil rights organization. Dr. Carter was a charismatic advocate with a deep understanding of systemic inequities. He saw Alicia's story as an opportunity to amplify a broader campaign for workplace equity. Your story resonates because it's not isolated, Dr. Carter said during their meeting. It reflects the experiences of so many others. If you're willing, we'd like to partner with you to push for industry-wide reforms. Alicia felt a swell of gratitude and resolve. I'm all in, she said. Let's make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. Within days, the partnership yielded immediate results. A press conference was organized, bringing together local media, activists, and even a few passengers from the flight who had come forward to share their perspectives. Alicia stood at the podium, her hands gripping the edges of the lectern as she addressed the room. What happened to me on that flight wasn't just a personal affront. She began, her voice clear and steady. It was a reflection of a larger problem. Bias, whether conscious or unconscious, affects real people in real ways. It's time we held institutions accountable. The room erupted in applause as Alicia finished her speech. Marcus stood at the back, his expression one of quiet pride. He knew how much courage it had taken for Alicia to share her story so publicly, and he was determined to support her every step of the way. The press conference proved to be a turning point. News outlets picked up the story, and social media buzzed with discussions about bias in the airline industry. The airline, now facing mounting public pressure, issued a public statement acknowledging the incident and pledging to work with advocacy groups to improve their policies. But Alicia wasn't content to stop there. She and Justine drafted a list of additional demands, including a public commitment to diversifying the airline's leadership team and implementing a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior. With Dr. Carter's backing, they presented these demands in a follow-up meeting with the airline's CEO. "We recognize the steps you've outlined," Alicia said during the meeting. "But we need to see measurable progress. Words are not enough." The CEO nodded, his expression serious. "You have my word that we will follow through. This is a wake-up call for us. And we're committed to doing better. Blank. Underscore. Blank." As the day ended, Alicia and Marcus found themselves back in the hotel, reflecting on the whirlwind of events. The fight was far from over, but they could see the tide beginning to turn. "Do you think it's enough?" Marcus asked as they sat on the balcony, the city lights twinkling below. "It's a start," Alicia said, "but real change takes time. We have to keep pushing." Marcus nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "You're stronger than you realize, Alicia, and you're making a difference." She smiled, a mix of exhaustion and determination in her eyes. "I'm just doing what needs to be done." The airline's headquarters sat in the heart of a bustling urban district, its sleek glass facade reflecting the motion of the city. Inside, Alicia sat in a small but well-appointed conference room, her notebook open in front of her. Across the table, Marcus leaned back slightly, his arms crossed as he surveyed the executives seated before them. Their expressions ranged from attentive to cautiously guarded. Richard Hale, the airline's CEO, cleared his throat and began to speak. "Miss Monroe, Mr. Monroe, thank you for meeting with us again. I want to reiterate our deepest apologies for what happened on your flight. We understand that this incident highlighted areas where we need to improve, and we're committed to making real changes." Alicia nodded, her gaze steady. "I appreciate the acknowledgement, Mr. Hale, but as I've said before, apologies are only the first step. What matters now is action." Richard gestured to a colleague, who began to present a detailed slide deck outlining the company's proposed reforms. The initiatives included mandatory bias training for all employees, the creation of a diversity and inclusion task force, and a review of leadership roles to increase representation. It was an ambitious plan, but Alicia listened with a critical ear, noting gaps where the measures felt more performative than transformative. When the presentation ended, Alicia leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but firm. "This is a start," she said, "but change doesn't happen just because policies are written. It requires accountability at every level. How will you measure success? How will you ensure these initiatives don't fade into the background over time?" Richard nodded thoughtfully. "Those are fair questions, Miss Monroe. We're working on establishing metrics for success, including employee feedback surveys and regular reviews of our progress. We'd also like to invite you to serve as an advisor to our task force. Given your invaluable insights." The offer caught Alicia off guard. Though she didn't show it, she exchanged a brief glance with Marcus, who gave a subtle nod of encouragement. "I'd be open to that," Alicia said carefully, "but only if my role is more than symbolic. If I'm going to help, I want to ensure these changes have real impact." "Of course," Richard agreed. "We're looking for meaningful input, not just optics." The conversation continued, delving into specifics about timelines, budgets, and leadership accountability. Alicia and Marcus pushed for concrete commitments, their calm persistence ensuring that nothing was left ambiguous. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Back at the hotel that evening, Alicia sat on the edge of her bed, rereading the notes she had taken during the meeting. The day's events felt significant, yet she couldn't shake a sense of caution. Words, after all, were easy to offer. Follow-through was far more difficult. Marcus entered the room, carrying 2 cups of tea. He handed one to Alicia and sat in the armchair by the window. "You did good today," he said. "We did good," Alicia corrected, offering a faint smile. She sipped her tea, her gaze distant. "But there's still so much work to do. Even with all their promises, I can't help but wonder how much of this is about optics. Maybe it is, Marcus said, but you're holding them accountable. That's what matters. Alicia nodded, though her thoughts remained heavy. It's just, every step forward feels like a fight. I want to believe things will change. But sometimes it's hard not to feel tired. Marcus leaned forward, his tone soft but resolute. You're allowed to feel tired. But you're also the reason these conversations are happening. They wouldn't be making these promises if you hadn't stood your ground. That's something. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Meanwhile, in a modest apartment on the other side of town, Cheryl Alden sat at her kitchen table, staring at a blank piece of paper. Beside her was a stack of books on workplace equity and unconscious bias. Their spines worn from frequent handling. Cheryl had been on leave since the incident. Her suspension a sharp reminder of the consequences of her actions. She picked up her pen and hesitated. Her thoughts tangled. Writing the letter to Alicia had been Justine's suggestion, though Cheryl had resisted at first. She wasn't sure if an apology would mean anything now. But as the days passed, the weight of what she had done and the harm it had caused grew harder to ignore. Finally, she began to write. The words came slowly, haltingly, but they carried a sincerity that surprised even her. She admitted to her biases, acknowledged the pain she had caused, and expressed a desire to change, not to absolve herself, but to do better moving forward. When the letter was finished, Cheryl folded it carefully and placed it in an envelope. She sat back and exhaled, the act of writing both cathartic and humbling. She didn't know if Alicia would read it, but for the first time in weeks, Cheryl felt a glimmer of hope that change was possible. Blank. Underscore. Blank. The next morning, Alicia received the letter. She opened it cautiously, unsure of what to expect. Cheryl's handwriting was neat, deliberate, the words on the page raw and unpolished. Alicia read the letter twice, her emotions shifting from skepticism to quiet reflection. She didn't know if she could forgive Cheryl, not yet. But the letter felt genuine. A small step toward reconciliation. Alicia folded the letter and placed it in her notebook, deciding to share it with Marcus and Justine later. Blank. Underscore. Blank. As the airline began implementing its reforms, Alicia's role as an advisor brought her into conversations she had never imagined being part of. She sat in meetings with executives, reviewed training materials, and helped shape policies that would impact thousands of employees. It was slow, often frustrating work, but Alicia approached it with the same quiet determination that had carried her through the events of the flight. During one training session, Alicia observed as Linda, the empathetic flight attendant from her flight, led a discussion on equity and inclusion. Linda had been promoted to a senior training role, a recognition of her integrity and professionalism. Watching Linda in action, Alicia felt a sense of pride. It was a reminder that even small acts of kindness and courage could ripple outward in unexpected ways. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Months later, Alicia stood at a town hall event hosted by the airline, addressing employees from across the organization. She spoke about the importance of accountability, the need for empathy, and the power of collective action. Change isn't easy, she said, her voice steady. It requires courage, persistence, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. But it's worth it, not just for the people who have been hurt, but for all of us. When we build a culture of respect and equity, everyone thrives. The room erupted in applause. But Alicia's focus was on the faces in the crowd. She saw employees who had been skeptical at first but were now engaged in the work of change. She saw leaders who were beginning to understand the weight of their responsibilities. And she saw herself, reflected in their hope and determination. Blank. Underscore. Blank. As the evening ended, Alicia and Marcus walked back to the hotel, the city lights twinkling around them. Marcus handed her a coffee, his grin teasing. For the record, you were incredible. Alicia laughed softly, the sound carrying a note of relief. I hope it makes a difference. It already has, Marcus said, and it will keep making a difference. As long as you keep pushing. Alicia looked up at the sky, her heart full of gratitude and resolve. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had also been transformative, not just for herself, but for everyone her fight had touched. Months had passed since Alicia's journey had taken an unexpected turn. The airline's reforms were underway, with Alicia's advisory role serving as a steady reminder that change was neither quick nor easy. Each meeting, each training session, and each policy update brought its own challenges. But progress was undeniable. Still, the echoes of that flight remained with her, a quiet undercurrent that surfaced in reflective moments. One crisp autumn morning, Alicia stood at the edge of a podium, preparing to speak at a symposium on equity in the workplace. The room was filled with community leaders, corporate executives, and activists, each drawn by the growing momentum of her story. She glanced at her notes, though she knew her message by heart. When she spoke, her voice carried the steady cadence of someone who had lived the lessons she now shared. "What happened to me on that flight wasn't unique," she began, her tone calm yet firm. "It was a reflection of systems that we all live within, systems that shape how we see ourselves and each other. Changing those systems isn't just about policies. It's about how we choose to act in the small moments, the ones that reveal who we are." The audience listened intently, many nodding in quiet agreement. Alicia didn't focus on dramatics. She didn't need to. Her words carried the weight of truth, spoken plainly but powerfully. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Later that evening, Alicia returned to her hotel room. Exhaustion settling over her, she dropped her bag onto the bed and sat by the window, watching the city below. Her phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. "You were amazing today. Proud of you." She smiled faintly, typing back a quick reply. "Thanks, big brother. Couldn't have done it without you." Her thoughts drifted to Cheryl Alden, the flight attendant whose actions had set so much in motion. Alicia hadn't heard from her since the letter, but she often wondered about Cheryl's journey. Had she followed through on her promises to learn and grow? Had the experience changed her in any lasting way? Cheryl, as it happened, was navigating her own quiet transformation. Since her suspension, she had immersed herself in learning, reading, attending workshops, and volunteering with organizations focused on equity and inclusion. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but she was committed. Each step felt like peeling back a layer, confronting assumptions she hadn't even known she held. One day, Cheryl reached out to the airline's diversity task force, asking to join as a volunteer. Her request was met with some hesitation, but her sincerity won out. Over time, she became an active participant, sharing her story as a cautionary tale but also as a testament to the possibility of growth. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Alicia learned of Cheryl's involvement through Linda, the flight attendant who had shown her kindness on the flight. They met for coffee during one of Alicia's visits to the airline's headquarters. "I thought you'd want to know," Linda said, stirring her tea. "She's trying. She's really trying." Alicia nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That's good to hear. Change is hard, but it's worth it if it's real." "It feels real," Linda said. "I think she's learned a lot from all of this." Alicia didn't respond immediately, letting the words settle. Forgiveness, she had realized, wasn't about excusing what had happened. It was about acknowledging the possibility of change while staying true to her own journey. Blank. Underscore. Blank. As the months rolled on, the airline began to see the fruits of its reforms. Employee surveys reflected a gradual but significant shift in workplace culture. The Diversity and Inclusion Task Force, bolstered by voices like Alicia's and Linda's, gained momentum. Stories of transformation, small and large, filtered through the organization, each one a reminder that change was possible. One such story came from a young employee in customer service who shared during a town hall event how the new training programs had opened her eyes to biases she hadn't recognized in herself. "It's not easy to admit when you've been wrong," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "but it's worth it if it means treating people better." Alicia listened to the young woman's words with quiet pride. Moments like these reminded her why she had fought so hard, not for herself, but for the countless others whose experiences might now be different. Blank. Underscore. Blank. On a chilly winter afternoon, Alicia visited her parents' home, a small but welcoming house filled with the warmth of family. Marcus was there, helping their father prepare dinner, while their mother set the table. As they sat down to eat, the conversation turned to Alicia's work. Her mother, ever practical, asked. Do you feel like you've made a difference? Alicia paused, considering the question. I think so, she said finally. But the work isn't done. It never really is. What matters is that we keep pushing. Keep building on what we've started. Her father nodded, his voice steady. You've always been strong, Alicia. That strength is making the world better. Even if it's one small step at a time. The words stayed with her long after dinner. As she sat by the fire with Marcus, sipping tea, the journey had been long. And it would continue. But she felt a quiet sense of peace knowing that she was part of something larger, something meaningful. Blank. Blank. Months later, as Alicia boarded a plane for another business trip, she found herself seated next to an older woman who struck up a conversation. You're Alicia Monroe, aren't you? The woman asked, her eyes warm with recognition. I am, Alicia replied, her tone polite but curious. I saw your story in the news. The woman said, what you did, it mattered. It reminded me that it's never too late to stand up for what's right. Alicia smiled, her heart full. Thank you, she said simply. As the plane lifted into the sky, Alicia gazed out the window. The clouds rolling past in a serene procession. The journey was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a deep and abiding hope. Change was possible, and it started with the courage to take the first step.